Chapter 1. A New Beginning. Daniel Carter had always believed that moving forward was the only way to survive life's hardest trials. He had experienced more than his fair share of heartbreak, but nothing compared to the loss of his wife, Elena. She had been the love of his life, the center of his world, and when she passed away suddenly, everything around him seemed to crumble. But Daniel didn't have the luxury of succumbing to grief. Not when he had Lucas, their 6-year-old son. His entire world was now wrapped up in that little boy, and that meant only one thing. He had to keep going. That was why he decided to move to Oak Hollow, a seemingly peaceful neighborhood just outside the city. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where he and Lucas could rebuild their lives together. The house was modest but comfortable, with a backyard big enough for Lucas to run around in, a tree perfect for hanging a swing, and an atmosphere that promised the sense of security Daniel desperately wanted for his son. At first, things seemed promising. Neighbors waved when they passed, kids rode their bikes on the sidewalks, and for a fleeting moment, Daniel almost convinced himself that this was where a child could grow up safe, happy, and free. Then they met Margaret Benson. She introduced herself within 24 hours of their moving truck pulling into the driveway. Daniel had been unloading boxes, sweat dripping down his back, when he saw her marching up the walkway. A woman in her early 50s, her short blonde bob styled so perfectly it didn't move even when the wind blew. She held a clipboard in one hand, and her expression carried an air of self-importance that made Daniel instantly wary. He wiped his hands on his jeans and forced a polite smile as she came to a stop at the edge of his porch. "You must be Mr. Carter," she said, as though she were the one welcoming him into her kingdom rather than the other way around. "That's right," Daniel replied. "And you are?" Margaret Benson, head of the Oak Hollow Community Committee. She glanced down at the clipboard, flipping through pages that appeared to be filled with handwritten notes. "I like to personally introduce myself to all new residents. It helps keep things running smoothly around here." Daniel had a bad feeling immediately. Still, he played nice, shook her hand, and let her rattle off a list of neighborhood expectations, lawn care regulations, garbage collection schedules, and local events. It was the kind of overbearing micromanagement that would have made Elena laugh out loud. But then, the conversation took a turn. "And where is Mrs. Carter?" Margaret asked, tilting her head slightly as if she already knew the answer. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. It was always a question he hated answering, not just because of the pain it carried, but because of how people reacted. Pity, awkwardness, unnecessary apologies. "She passed away last year," Daniel said simply. Margaret's eyes widened just a little, but it wasn't sympathy that flashed across her face. It was something else, something calculating. "Oh," she said too quickly. "That must be difficult." Daniel nodded, already wanting to end the conversation. "Yeah, well, Lucas and I are doing okay." Margaret's expression didn't shift. "And how old is Lucas?" 6. Her lips curled slightly, just for a second, before she smoothed it out so quickly that Daniel almost missed it. "That's quite young," she said, her voice dripping with something condescending. "And you're raising him alone?" Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew this type of person, the kind that had already made up their mind about him before he even had a chance to prove himself. "Yes," he said firmly. "And he's doing great." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile a school principal gives a troublemaker on the first day of class, reserved judgment, fake politeness, and a promise that she'd be watching. "Well," she said, clasping her hands together, "if you need any parenting advice, I'd be happy to help. We have certain standards in Oak Hollow, and all children must be raised properly." Daniel clenched his jaw. There it was. He forced a smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I've got it covered." Margaret's smile never wavered, but Daniel could tell she didn't like that answer. "Well," she said, flipping through her clipboard again, "I'll be sure to check in. We take care of each other here in Oak Hollow." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome counting down to inevitable trouble. Daniel watched her go, exhaling slowly. He had dealt with judgmental people before. Being a single father came with its fair share of side eyes and unsolicited advice, people assuming he wasn't capable, that he didn't know how to cook, that he was just some clueless man fumbling through fatherhood. But Margaret was different. Her judgment wasn't just passive disapproval. It was a mission, and Daniel was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. Chapter 2. The first signs of trouble. The first signs of trouble came sooner than Daniel expected. It started subtly, almost innocently. Margaret Benson lingering a little too long outside his house whenever Lucas played in the yard, her clipboard always in hand, as if she were conducting an ongoing evaluation. At first, Daniel tried to brush it off as neighborhood eccentricity, but it didn't take long for her presence to start feeling more intrusive than neighborly. Then came the notes. The first one appeared on his door one morning, written in precise, elegant script on a piece of Oak Hollow Community Committee stationery. Your lawn is overgrown by 2 inches, exceeding HOA regulations. Please address this promptly. Daniel frowned at the message. His lawn was barely longer than his neighbor's, but he grabbed his mower and trimmed it anyway, not wanting to cause unnecessary friction. A week later, another note. Your garbage bins were left out 30 minutes past collection. This is not acceptable in Oak Hollow. That was when Daniel began to suspect that this was more than just strict HOA enforcement. No other house on the street had received similar warnings, at least, none that he could see. It was becoming clear that Margaret had made him her personal project. He was willing to ignore it, at first. He had a 6-year-old to take care of, and a new job to focus on, and he wasn't about to waste energy worrying about a micromanaging neighbor. But then, one evening, things escalated. Daniel had just sat down on the porch with a beer, watching Lucas play with his toy trucks in the grass, when he noticed Margaret standing on the sidewalk, watching them. Not just passing by, standing, openly observing, clipboard in hand. Annoyance flared in Daniel's chest, but he kept his voice calm as he spoke. Can I help you, Margaret? She smiled, stepping closer. Oh, I was just passing by and noticed Lucas out here. Are you sure it's safe for him to be playing outside unattended? Daniel raised an eyebrow. He's not unattended. I'm right here. Margaret tilted her head. I just mean, without a mother's supervision, sometimes things get overlooked. Daniel's grip on his beer tightened. He's doing just fine. Margaret sighed as if Daniel had just failed some unspoken test. I'm sure you're trying your best, Daniel. But Oak Hollow has certain standards, and we just want to make sure all of our children are raised properly. He forced a smile. Thanks for your concern. We're good. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. I'll be checking in. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Daniel with the unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. A Neighbor's Warning. The next morning, Daniel was loading Lucas into the car for school when a voice called out from the house next door. Hey, Carter. Daniel turned to see Tom Davies, his next-door neighbor, walking over with a coffee mug in hand. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, Tom had the easy confidence of someone who had lived in Oak Hollow long enough to know its inner workings. Tom glanced around, then lowered his voice. Saw Margaret bothering you yesterday. Daniel sighed. Yeah, seems like she's got an issue with me. Tom let out a dry chuckle. That woman has an issue with everyone who doesn't fit her mold. Single dad, new to the neighborhood? You're exactly the type she likes to target. Daniel frowned. She's really that bad? Tom nodded. Worse. She's got power on the community board, and she's not afraid to use it. She gets into people's business, files complaints, makes life miserable if she doesn't approve of how you live. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Great. Tom took a sip of his coffee. Look, my advice? Don't let her push you around. But also, watch your back. Margaret plays dirty when she wants someone gone. Daniel's jaw clenched. He wasn't planning on going anywhere. Thanks for the warning, he said. Tom gave him a pat on the shoulder. Anytime. As Daniel pulled out of the driveway and drove Lucas to school, a thought settled uncomfortably in his mind. Margaret wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a problem, and something told him she was just getting started. Chapter 4. The pressure increases. Days passed, and Margaret's interference only grew worse. More notes appeared on Daniel's door, each one nitpicking minor infractions, an out-of-place flower pot, a windblown lawn chair, even a stray toy left in the yard. It was clear she was watching him constantly, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. One evening, Daniel arrived home from work to find Lucas sitting on the front porch, his head downcast. His stomach tightened at the sight. Hey, buddy, what's wrong? Daniel asked, crouching down. Lucas looked up with a frown. Mrs. Benson told me I'm not supposed to run on the grass. She said it's bad for the neighborhood. Daniel's jaw clenched. She told you that? Lucas nodded. She came over when you were gone. She said I should tell you to read the rule book. Daniel felt a surge of anger, but forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't about to scare his son because of a petty neighborhood dictator. You don't worry about her, okay? You can run in the yard all you want. This is our home. Lucas smiled faintly, but the encounter had clearly shaken him. That was the final straw. Daniel wasn't going to sit back and let Margaret control his family's life. Chapter 5. A Confrontation. The next afternoon, Daniel spotted Margaret tending to her pristine flower bed, clipboard tucked under her arm as always. He strode across the street, his frustration barely contained. "Margaret, we need to talk." She looked up, her face the picture of polite indifference. "Oh, Daniel, is there a problem?" "Yeah, there is. You came onto my property and told my son he couldn't play in his own yard. That's not okay." Margaret sighed, shaking her head. "Daniel, I was merely educating him on our community's standards. We take pride in our neighborhood, and unruly behavior can diminish property values." "He's 6, Daniel snapped. "He's not damaging anything. And you have no right to speak to him like that without my permission." Margaret pursed her lips. "I understand you're new here, but rules are rules. And I simply assumed you'd appreciate guidance. After all, single parenting is difficult." Daniel's blood boiled. "My parenting is none of your business. You don't dictate how I raise my son, and you certainly don't have authority over what happens in my yard." Margaret's smile was thin. "I was only trying to help. But if you insist on being difficult, perhaps I'll have to escalate things through the appropriate channels." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Do whatever you think you need to, Margaret. But stay away from my kid." As he turned to walk away, he caught the flicker of something cold in her eyes. This wasn't over. Chapter 6. The First Threat. Daniel barely had time to process the confrontation before things took a more serious turn. That evening, as he was putting Lucas to bed, a knock sounded at the door. Expecting Tom or another neighbor, he opened it without hesitation, only to find an official-looking envelope taped to the frame. He pulled it down, his stomach sinking as he read the bold heading. Notice of community violations. The list inside was absurd. Claims of noise complaints, improper garbage disposal, and unauthorized yard decor. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Margaret wasn't just harassing him anymore. She was building a case again. Chapter 7. An Unexpected Ally. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the community violation notice in front of him, his fingers drumming against the surface. He needed to figure out his next move before Margaret pushed things further. He was about to pick up his phone and call Tom when another knock came at the door. This time, he hesitated before opening it. But when he did, he was met with a surprise: Sarah Mitchell, a neighbor from down the street. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp green eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Daniel, we need to talk," she said, stepping inside before he could invite her. He frowned. "Is this about Margaret?" Sarah nodded. "I saw her snooping around your property the other day. And now I hear she's filing complaints against you. I figured you'd need some help." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Help?" Sarah crossed her arms. "I've lived here long enough to know how Margaret operates. She picks a target, makes their life hell, and doesn't stop until they either fall in line or move away. She's done it before, but she doesn't have as much power as she thinks." Daniel leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Sarah smirked. "The HOA isn't just her playground. She might be loud, but she's not the only one with influence. Some of us are sick of her power trips. If you're willing to stand your ground, you might have more support than you think." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Chapter 8. A Plan Forms. Over the next few days, Sarah introduced Daniel to several other neighbors who had their own grievances with Margaret. An elderly couple had been fined for planting roses that weren't HOA approved. A single mother had been accused of lowering property values by having a trampoline in her yard. A retired veteran who had been harassed about the height of his flagpole. Margaret had been terrorizing Oak Hollow for years. "The problem," Sarah explained, "is that nobody's fought back before. She bullies people into silence. But if we all push back at the same time, she won't know how to handle it." Daniel nodded. "So what's the plan?" Sarah grinned. "We start gathering evidence. Document everything. Her harassment, her false complaints, everything she's done to make people miserable. And then, we take it to the HOA board and demand action." Daniel felt a sense of determination settles in. Margaret had picked the wrong person to target this time. Chapter 9. Margaret strikes again. Just as Daniel and Sarah's alliance was gaining momentum, Margaret made another move. One evening, as Daniel was helping Lucas with his homework, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his stomach dropped. Urgent. HOA disciplinary hearing. Your presence required. Sarah, who was sitting across the table from him, read the message over his shoulder. She's trying to get you officially reprimanded. Maybe even kicked out. Daniel exhaled sharply. Then we better be ready. The battle for Oak Hollow had officially begun. Chapter 10. The hearing begins. The day of the HOA disciplinary hearing arrived faster than Daniel had anticipated. He stood outside the Oak Hollow Community Center, gripping a folder filled with documentation of Margaret's harassment. Sarah stood beside him, arms crossed, exuding confidence. Remember, she said, Margaret thrives on intimidation. If we stay calm and present our case logically, she won't stand a chance. Daniel nodded, though his pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for Lucas, for his home, for the right to live without constant scrutiny. Inside, the room was filled with HOA board members, a handful of neighbors, and Margaret herself, seated at the head of the table like a queen awaiting tribute. She offered Daniel a saccharine smile as he entered. Mr. Carter, she greeted. I trust you've had time to review the violations? Daniel took his seat, placing the folder on the table. I have. And I've also gathered evidence of your targeted harassment against me and other residents of Oak Hollow. Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Harassment? I merely enforce the rules. The board president, a stern-looking man named Robert Fields, cleared his throat. Let's go one at a time. Margaret, you've accused Mr. Carter of multiple community violations. Would you care to summarize your concerns? Margaret sat up straighter. Certainly. Mr. Carter has continuously failed to comply with community guidelines. His lawn has been unkempt, he's left trash bins out past collection hours, and most concerning, his child is often unsupervised, which poses a risk to neighborhood safety. Daniel clenched his jaw. That's not true. My lawn is maintained, I follow trash collection rules, and my son is never unsupervised. This is a personal vendetta, not an enforcement of community guidelines. Robert turned to Daniel. Do you have evidence to support that claim? Daniel slid his folder across the table. I do. Signed statements from multiple neighbors detailing Margaret's pattern of excessive rule enforcement, selective targeting, and even unauthorized surveillance on my property. I also have security footage of her loitering outside my house and speaking to my son without my consent. The room fell silent as Robert flipped through the documents. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but Daniel noticed her fingers tightening around the armrests of her chair. After several long moments, Robert sighed and closed the folder. Margaret, these are serious allegations. If true, they represent a misuse of your position within the HOA. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice spoke up. I can confirm Daniel's claims. All heads turned toward Tom Davies, who had just entered the room. He nodded at Daniel before facing the board. Margaret has been harassing residents for years, pushing people around, and filing complaints for things that wouldn't even be an issue if she didn't personally dislike the person. It's time someone put a stop to it. Murmurs rippled through the room. Other neighbors began speaking up, adding their own experiences. Margaret's carefully curated image was beginning to crumble. Robert rubbed his temples. It seems there is a pattern here. Given the evidence presented, we will be reviewing Margaret's conduct as an HOA official. Until further notice, she is relieved of any enforcement duties. Margaret's mouth fell open. You can't be serious. This meeting is adjourned, Robert cut in firmly. Thank you all for your time. As the room emptied, Daniel let out a breath of relief. Sarah clapped him on the back. Told you she wasn't invincible. Margaret, however, remained seated, her expression dark and unreadable. Daniel met her gaze and saw something in her eyes that made his stomach twist. This wasn't over. Chapter 11. The Retaliation. The victory at the HOA hearing was short-lived. 2 nights later, Daniel woke to the sound of a loud crash outside. He grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the front yard, heart pounding. His mailbox had been smashed to pieces. A cold anger settled in his chest. He knew exactly who was behind this. Sarah appeared beside him, having heard the noise from next door. You think it was her? Daniel exhaled sharply. I don't think. I know. They stood in silence, surveying the damage. It was a message. Margaret might have lost her official power, but she wasn't done making his life miserable. Sarah crossed her arms. Then we're not done fighting. Daniel nodded. The battle for Oak Hollow wasn't over yet. Chapter 12, Escalation. The next morning, Daniel stood in front of what remained of his mailbox, his jaw tight. He had expected retaliation, but the destruction of his property was a new low, even for Margaret. Lucas stood beside him, clutching his backpack, his small face creased with concern. Dad, are we moving again? Daniel's heart clenched at the question. No, buddy. We're not going anywhere. Sarah walked over, her phone in hand. I called the police. They're sending someone over. Not that they'll do much, Daniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. It's just a mailbox. Sarah scoffed. It's intimidation, and we're not letting her get away with it. Moments later, a patrol car pulled up. Officer Ryan Briggs, a stocky man with sharp eyes, stepped out, taking in the scene. Morning, folks. Looks like we've got some vandalism. Daniel nodded. Yeah, I think we both know who's behind it. Briggs sighed, pulling out a notepad. You got proof? Witnesses? Security cameras? Sarah and Daniel exchanged a look. No, Daniel admitted. But Margaret lost her power in the HOA 2 days ago. This isn't a coincidence. Briggs scribbled something down. I'll file a report, but without evidence, there's not much we can do. If it happens again, get a camera up. As Briggs left, Daniel turned to Sarah. She's not stopping. What's next? Sarah's lips curled into a determined smirk. We make sure she is nowhere left to hide. Chapter 13, A Neighborhood Divided. Over the next few days, news of the vandalism spread through Oak Hollow. Some neighbors sympathized with Daniel, while others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid of getting caught in Margaret's crosshairs. Then, an anonymous letter appeared on Daniel's doorstep. Stay in your lane, or things will get worse. This isn't your neighborhood. Daniel clenched his fists as he read the words. He showed the note to Sarah, who exhaled sharply. She's escalating. This is a threat. Daniel nodded. Then it's time to turn the tables. Chapter 14, The Investigation. With Sarah's help, Daniel began gathering as much evidence as he could. They spoke with the neighbors Margaret had harassed, collecting written testimonies. Tom managed to find old emails where Margaret had bullied past HOA board members into resigning. And then came the biggest breakthrough. Sarah discovered an overlooked rule in the HOA charter. Any member caught abusing their position could face a permanent ban from all neighborhood affairs. Daniel grinned as he read the document. This could be it. If we can prove she's behind the threats and vandalism, she won't just lose power, she'll be gone for good. Sarah smirked. Time to bring the queen down. Chapter 15, The Final Confrontation. The neighborhood meeting that month was more crowded than ever. Word had spread that Daniel and Sarah were bringing forth charges against Margaret, and curiosity had drawn a crowd. Margaret sat at the front, her lips pursed, but Daniel noticed the flicker of unease in her expression. Robert Fields called the meeting to order. We have a serious matter to discuss today. Mr. Carter and Ms. Mitchell have filed a formal complaint against Margaret Benson for misconduct, harassment, and intimidation. Margaret scoffed. This is ridiculous. They have no proof. Daniel stood. We have signed testimonies from multiple neighbors detailing years of bullying and abuse of power. We also have evidence that connects you to anonymous threats and HOA violations meant to push me out of my home. Sarah passed a stack of documents to the board members. And we found a clause in the HOA charter that allows for a permanent ban on any member caught abusing their authority. Margaret's face paled. This is a witch hunt. Robert adjusted his glasses. We will review this evidence and hold a formal vote next week. Until then, Margaret, you are barred from participating in any HOA activities. Murmurs rippled through the room. Margaret shot Daniel a venomous glare before storming out. Sarah grinned. I think that went well. Daniel exhaled. One more week. Then we'll see if she's finally done. Chapter 16, A New Beginning. A week later, the verdict was in. Margaret had been officially banned from all HOA activities and stripped of any authority in Oak Hollow. Her reign was over. Daniel and Sarah stood outside as the news spread, neighbors cautiously beginning to approach with relief and apologies. Thank you for standing up to her, one woman said. We should have done it sooner. Daniel smiled. Better late than never. Lucas tugged on his father's sleeve. Does this mean we can finally put up Christmas lights this year? Daniel laughed, ruffling his son's hair. Yeah, buddy. As many as you want. For the first time since moving to Oak Hollow, Daniel felt something new. Peace. And Margaret? She was nothing more than a bad memory. Chapter 17. The Aftermath. In the days following Margaret's downfall, the atmosphere in Oak Hollow shifted. The once tense neighborhood felt lighter, conversations more open, and people who had previously kept to themselves now gathered in driveways and front yards, no longer fearing the scrutiny of overbearing authority. Daniel noticed the change immediately. For the first time since moving to Oak Hollow, he could sit on his porch without feeling watched. Lucas could play freely in the yard without someone taking notes on his every movement. The relief was palpable. One evening, Tom dropped by with a six-pack of beer. Well, you did it, he said, cracking one open. You finally got rid of the Queen of Tyranny. Daniel chuckled, taking a seat. I didn't do it alone. Sarah, you, and the rest of the neighborhood, everyone had a part in this. Tom raised his bottle. Still, you were the one who stood up to her first. That took guts. Sarah joined them a few minutes later, carrying a plate of homemade cookies. So, she said, setting the plate down, what now? Do we declare today a neighborhood holiday? Freedom from Margaret Day? Daniel laughed. I think we just enjoy the peace while it lasts. Sarah smirked. Speaking of peace, rumor has it Margaret put her house on the market. She's officially moving out. Tom nearly spit out his drink. No way. That's the best news I've heard all year. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Any idea where she's going? Sarah shrugged. Nobody knows. But let's just say there's a collective sigh of relief that she won't be our problem anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly, letting the weight of those words settle. It was over. Truly over. Chapter 18, A Fresh Start. 2 months later, Oak Hollow had transformed. Without Margaret's oppressive rule, the community flourished. Families decorated their homes as they pleased, holiday lights twinkled freely, and laughter filled the streets without fear of written warnings. Daniel and Lucas found themselves more involved in neighborhood activities. Lucas made new friends, and Daniel finally felt like Oak Hollow was home. One afternoon, as Daniel was setting up a new swing set in the backyard, Sarah leaned on the fence that separated their properties. You know, I think you're stuck with us now, she teased. Daniel smirked. I think I'm okay with that. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. It's been nice, you know, having you and Lucas here. Daniel met her gaze, something warm and unspoken passing between them. Yeah, it has. For the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was living. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. As the sun set over Oak Hollow, Daniel sat on the porch, watching Lucas play with the other kids in the neighborhood. The battle had been fought, the storm had passed, and now, for the first time, the future looked bright.